Let's focus back on the aid crisis in Gaza. We can speak now to Jesse Marks, who's a senior advocate for the Middle East at Refugees International, joins us live from Washington, DC. Jesse, so aid drops are happening, maritime supplies look set to come in, but is it going to be enough? We've heard 300 trucks a day of aid are needed for the north of Gaza alone.
The Israeli authorities have argued, including in front of the ICJ, that they have facilitated aid, and they have allowed some levels of, but as we can see, against kind of a clear pattern of wider obstruction of aid deliveries, we have not seen sufficient amounts get in. And when we have seen the Israelis attempt to provide smaller amounts of aid outside of the UN, we saw the carnage that occurred just last week. Now, the pursuit of more complicated and last resort aid responses like airdrops, like maritime corridors, further point to a level of culpability. Functionally, these things are not sustainable. Airdrops are typically the last resort way to deliver aid, and these are only used when there is no other option. They're logistically challenging and they're expensive and only allow a small amount of aid in the end. Meanwhile, a maritime corridor is not going to be a silver bullet. Think about the scale of desperation and destruction in the north that until now has gone unabated. We have issues of truck availability. I spoke to someone on the ground yesterday who noted that an absence of trucks is going to make it very challenging to actually move aid from the coastline into the areas where it is critically needed across the north. And this further raises questions about the ongoing closure and limitations of the borders in the south. We have in the north Karni and areas that remain closed. You can easily move large amounts of aid through those by land from the Ashdod port in northern Gaza and in Israel. And in the south, we still have Rafah and Kerem Shalom, which until now are effectively blocked up.
All right. So aid drops insufficient, maritime logistics difficult, getting aid from port to where they're needed. What's the solution?
Or open more borders. We have seen that when there is will and when there is capability, both of which are on the table right now, you can move up to 500 trucks a day. The aid system into Gaza is not new. There was an aid corridor from Jordan that has been going on for nearly 2 decades. But after October 7th, that situation became increasingly more complex with more blocks. Now, to that point, the Jordanians are having to move trucks without scanners in certain cases across the border, or in some cases by ferry across from Aqaba through Egypt. Like, the system has become so complex, and the number of arbitrary impediments on the table have made it such that, a truck which might normally prior to the war take just a couple of hours to drive might take multiple days. So fundamentally, the Israelis have to facilitate more aid. This requires the White House is going to have to put more pressure. You can pursue more complicated concepts like maritime corridors and airdrops, but fundamentally, the ground route is still the most viable.
How concerned are you that if a ceasefire is not agreed, and it's stalled right now, that the situation is just going to spiral into one of yet more tragedy and horror for those in Gaza?
We thought we saw the worst case in December when they were attempting to negotiate the last ceasefire. The situation has become infinitely worse. We are already seeing famine and pockets of famine pop up around Gaza. We've already seen the first casualties as a result of malnutrition and dehydration among children. The situation is already at its worst, and it will continue to slip. There were experts at Johns Hopkins University just flagged recently that we're expecting a worse casualty event, the potential of an additional 70,000 casualties by August if things continue to move without any kind of peace or even slow down in the conflict. But now we're contending with a potential invasion into Rafah. We're looking at 1.5 million people who are already starving, suffering from overcrowded conditions, lack of medical access, and without a feasible means to deliver and surge large amounts of aid to them. We're looking at a mass casualty event in the coming months.
Now, your team traveled to Egypt, Jordan, and to Israel and to Gaza in January, I think it was, wasn't it? So tell us just very briefly what you found in terms of when you spoke to those who've fled the fighting and also those involved in the aid provision.
Certainly. I mean, our research painted a very different picture than what the Israelis painted at the ICJ, right? We saw routine and arbitrary denial of basic humanitarian goods. In one case, we spoke with an NGO who told us because they couldn't deliver tent poles, they were forced to send in plastic tarp and duct tape and told recipients on the other side to dig through the rubble to find metal bars. Like, that level of control over items that in any other crisis would be perceived as acceptable just to provide people a level of shelter. We also saw a highly complicated Israeli inspection and approval process that lacked any sense of clear and consistent instructions. On top of all of this, inside of Gaza, we spoke with a number of people, both in the UN and NGOs and Palestinians themselves, who saw frequent denials of basic humanitarian movements. It was increasingly challenging for the UN to leave their warehouses and provide aid north of the Wadi Gaza line into the north, where even going back 2 months, we saw severe levels of starvation, and we've seen those slip even worse since. And across the board, NGOs told us they are scared. People who deliver aid themselves are incapable of delivering aid because of how the conduct of this war has been fought.
Okay.
This is what's made.
Jesse, sorry to interrupt there, but we are going to have to move on. Do you appreciate it? It's very clear the situation is beyond crisis point. I do appreciate your perspective. Jesse Marks from Refugees International. Thank you.
Thank you.